There are moments when even the void seems to hesitate when its endless dark gathers close, not as emptiness but as a presence waiting to swallow whatever slips between the stars. Every soul in the Imperium has whispered fear of that unseen horizon, yet none truly understand what prowls there. They know only the echoes, the ships that vanish without a final astropathic scream, the navigators who awaken blind with visions they cannot describe, the servitors found adrift with their minds erased like wax beneath a flame. Somewhere beyond the Astronomican's fading glow lies a road humanity was never meant to walk, a highway of broken light where the living and the unmade brush against one another in silence. Some say the warp merely devours, others whisper that it reshapes, preserving fragments of thought long after flesh is gone. But what truly becomes of a soul lost between the stars remains the Imperium's most guarded fear buried beneath lit, drowned in prayer, and sealed behind the armor of a billion warriors who would rather die than imagine a world where the Emperor's light cannot find them. If you have ever wondered what waits in that infinite gulf, what happens when the light fails, when the Astronomican, when a human soul drifts alone through a dark that feels almost aware, stay with his story. The truth is not simple, it is not kind, it is not even certain, but it is whispered everywhere. From the gilded walls of terror to the rusted corridors of half-forgotten void ships that no soul is ever truly lost, only claimed by something that watches from beyond sight. Before we go deeper into this dread path, traveler, steady your footing. The chronicles you are about to follow take time, blood, and countless vanished voices to assemble. If you wish to keep these explorations alive in the endless dark, lend your strength, like, share, and subscribe so this archive may continue to shine. Where the void would rather it fall silent. The void was never meant to be silent. Every veteran of warp travel learned that truth early, long before scars and sleepless nights began carving their quiet lessons into the mind. Even when the Geller fields hummed steady and the navigators whispered their canticles to the unseen currents, the Imperium always pressed close, churning like a tide of distant storms beyond the hull. Silence meant absence. Silence meant something watching. Silence meant that the Astronomican's golden flame, once a constant pulse against the darkness, had thinned to something frail and far away. On the seventh day, without a stable fix on the light of terror, that silence became the only thing anyone aboard the vigilant petitioner could hear. The corridors carried it like a sickness. Each footfall rang too sharply on the metal decking, as though the ship itself were listening. Condensation beaded on the pipes overhead, cold enough to sting the fingertips, yet the air tasted warm and stale, like recycled breath steeped in anxiety. The emergency lumen strips cast a dim ochre glow that flickered whenever the warp currents swelled, stretching shadows across the walls like reaching hands. No one walked alone anymore. Even seasoned helmsmen moved in tight pairs, their eyes flicking toward the nearest bulkhead whenever the ship's frame groaned as if under an unseen weight. I remember gripping the rails outside the primary Vox chamber, feeling the metal vibrate with a rhythm that didn't match the ship's engines. Somewhere deep in the hull, something pulsed, faint as a heartbeat trapped beneath miles of steel and circuitry. The techodepts insisted it was nothing, a harmonics quirk, a resonance from our damaged warp veins, but their voices trembled despite the monotone cadence they forced into their speech. Even the skittery escorts stationed near the command deck seemed restless, their flatulences narrowing whenever the lights guttered and the air hummed as if in anticipation. We had lost contact with every vessel in our convoy 2 days earlier. One moment the Vox crackled with terse status reports, and the next it collapsed into a hush, so absolute it left a ringing ache in the ears. The astropaths remained locked in their sanctum, motionless beneath incense smoke. Their milky eyes rolled upward as if they witnessed something just beyond mortal sight. A single word had escaped them before they fell into trance. Drifting. No one asked what it meant. No one wanted to. When I stepped through the threshold into the Vox chamber, the stale atmosphere tightened around me like a closing fist. The chamber was vast, lined with rows of consoles once alive with scrolling data streams and flickering holoscreens. Now most of the displays were dead, their surfaces dark except for the occasional static flare that illuminated the room in pale bursts. Only one station remained active, pulsing with a faint green-teal glow that shimmered like distant WARP light filtered through water. A lone Vox operator sat before it, shoulders hunched, fingers trembling above the runes. His complexion had the parchment-pale look of someone who had not slept in days. The sound leaking through the remaining channel was thin enough to resemble breathing, a soft rasp, slow and uneven. I expected it to be signal degradation from the warp tides shearing against our hull, but then the rasp shaped itself into something rhythmic, something disturbingly human. and the Vox operator recoiled as if struck. "It's repeating," he whispered without turning. "The same breath, same cadence. It's been doing that since the beacon dimmed. No caller identified, no vessel signature, just breath." I moved closer, keeping my voice steady. "Have you isolated the source?" He nodded once, though the motion was reluctant, as if acknowledging the truth lent it power. "Deep void. No proximity markers. It shouldn't be possible. Nothing survives out there without shielding. Nothing human, nothing real." His hands hovered above the controls again, hesitant to touch them, as though making contact might allow whatever lingered on the signal to notice him. The breathing shifted. A tremor passed through the audio feed, low and shuddering, like something struggling to inhale through ruined lungs. Then, woven through the distortion, came a sound so faint it barely rose above the static, yet unmistakably a voice. Not speech, not words, just the outline of a voice. The hollow impression of someone trying to remember how language felt. The hairs along my arms lifted as if the ship's recycled air had turned to ice. The Vox operator's voice cracked. "It knows we're listening." For a heartbeat, the chamber seemed to contract, the shadows thickening around the consoles. The green-teal glow pulsed once, twice, then flared bright enough to cast sharp reflections across the metal floor. I leaned closer to the speaker grill, feeling the warmth of the machine against my cheek, and the breath on the other end grew sharper, more deliberate, as though it matched its rhythm to mine. Something in that mimicry felt utterly wrong, like staring into a mirror that smiled a heartbeat before you did. The operator swallowed hard. "If this is a stranded crewman, they should be dead. There's no life support signature, no distress call, just breath from a place where nothing breathes." The speaker crackled again, then the breath warped, twisting into a strained exhale that seemed to stretch too long, too close, ending in a low, almost sorrowful sound. The magnitude of what we were hearing settled inside me like a weight. This was not a message sent from a living human voice. This was an echo that had survived its speaker, and the echo wanted us to listen. The breath on the VOTS line lingered long after the machinery fell still, clinging to the air like the memory of a whisper that refused to die. Something inside that sound felt too close, too deliberate, as though the void itself leaned near the hole to listen for our reactions. The Vox operator hunched forward with his head in his shaking hands, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was different from the silence that haunted the ship. This one was human, fragile, painfully real, and it broke long before the other would. A shudder rolled through the deck plates beneath my boots, subtle at first, then sharpening into a series of strained metallic pops that echoed down the length of the chamber. The lumen strips flickered, casting the room into strobe-lit fragments where each flash revealed a new angle of our fear. Somewhere beyond the bulkheads, a distant groan traveled through the vigilant petitioner's frame, like something enormous brushing across the hull. The Vox operator lifted his head with a hollow stare. "It's following us," he said, though no instrument suggested motion outside. But the conviction in his voice rooted into me all the same. A burst of static exploded through the speakers, loud enough to sting my ears. The green-teal shimmer across the console spiked upward, matching the erratic pulse of a dying heartbeat. Then the breathing returned fast and now ragged, as though whatever produced it was running, not toward safety. Toward us a distorted cadence emerged, like the faint outline of words scattered and reshaped by forces incapable of understanding them. The operator scrambled backward, knocking over his chair as the sound rose into a strained keen that made the lumen strips dim under its resonance. I stepped between him and the console without thinking, unable to pull my eyes away from the pulsing glow. The keen fractured into a trembling moan. Then, impossibly, fragments of a voice surfaced, faint, warped, and half. It spoke my name, not clearly, not with the weight of memory, but with the shape of a voice that once knew it. A shape pulled thin, stretched across distances no human throat could survive. I staggered back as the breath hitched into a desperate, almost pleading rhythm. The Vox chamber felt smaller, the air thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic temps of overheated circuitry. The operator crawled toward the far wall, eyes wide, mouth trembling as if caught between prayer and panic. The console glowed brighter, too bright for damaged machinery, and the sound shifted again, this time into a low, wavering hum that vibrated through my teeth. "That's not a signal," he whispered. "It's presence." Before I could respond, the chamber's secondary doors slid open and Mago's adept Lathriel entered, flanked by two. Their steps were unnervingly synchronized, their forms washed in the cold green-teal gleam radiating from the console. Lathriel's mechadendrites twitched as he assessed the machinery, the lenses of his helm rotating with a sharp metallic click. "Unidentified transmission detected," he intoned, voice scraped clean of emotion. Origin unverified. Nature unknown. You will step aside. I did, though every instinct in me resisted. The Magos extended a limb toward the console, sparks skittering across his augmetic fingertips as he probed the ancient circuitry. The breath on the line faltered, as though recoiling from his touch. The hum quivered under his instrumentation, then deepened into a sound like distant thunder muffled beneath layers of static and sorrow. The Skittery raised their rifles, though no target existed. Magos, I said, forcing my voice into a steady line. This signal, if it's even a signal, might come from a lost vessel, a survivor. The Magos straightened his augmentics worry. Biological pattern inconsistent with survivability parameters. No void-capable transmission matrix present. Interpretation: this is not a man. The breath surged suddenly, loud and violent, filling the chamber with a guttural exhale that sent every lumen strip into darkness for a single heartbeat. The void outside felt close enough to press its face against the hull. When the lights returned, the console's glow had dimmed, flickering like a candle in a failing shrine. The Magos withdrew, mechadendrites coiling. The machine spirit is distressed. This interference must be contained. His mechanical eyes fixed on me. You will purge this channel. I opened my mouth, but another burst of sound erupted, a fractured cry, stretched thin as shattered glass. For a moment it resolved into something horrifyingly intimate, as though the signal remembered the shape of the body it once inhabited. It gasped my name again, and then, like a dying ember blown from its wick, the sound vanished. Silence reclaimed the chamber, heavier than before, settling into the metal, the wiring, our skin. The console went dark. The breath stopped. But the operator began to weep softly, helplessly, because he understood what I had not yet allowed myself to believe. The signal had not been terminated. It had simply stepped away, the way a man might step back into the shadows while deciding whether to return. And somewhere in that shadow, something new, my name, the Vigilant Petitioner, drifted through the void like a wounded animal that had forgotten how to breathe. The engine still churned in uneven bursts, coughing heat down the length of the ship. But every time the warp current swelled, the vessel seemed to flinch. The Gellerfield emitters flickered in thin pulses that trembled across the bulkheads, each one arriving a fraction too late, as though they struggled to remember the rhythm of their own protection. No one said the words aloud that the Astronomican's glow had faded further, that the path through the Imperium felt less like a corridor and more like the throat of something waiting. But every crewman felt it the way the body feels cold before frostbite. By the time I reached the central spine of the ship, the air had grown heavy enough to taste. There was an acrid sting beneath each breath, the tang of overtaxed circuitry braided with something sweeter, like burnt incense leaking through unseen seams. The metal around me vibrated with a low-frequency hum that didn't match the generators, a sound too steady for machinery and too alive for coincidence. I pressed my palm against the wall and felt it quiver under my touch, as though the ship were listening again. Voices drifted through the corridors, not spoken by any living tongue but carried by the shifting tension of the warp. They came in faint, fractured murmurs that seemed to echo from behind the bulkhead, sometimes too distant to decipher, sometimes close enough to feel the breath that should not exist. Crewmen hurried past in tight formation, refusing to meet my eyes, their movements clipped and uneven. No one wanted to linger long in any one place. Stillness had become the enemy. At the entrance to the navigator's sanctum, two custodian-trained shipwardens stood rigid with their halberds crossed, their armor reflecting the dim ochre lumens like embers trapped behind soot-black lacquer. Their visors tracked me with slow, wary precision. Even they looked unsettled. The wardens were bred for discipline, conditioned to face horrors without flinching. But the warp currents that brushed against the hull now were no ordinary storms. They carried intention. I passed between them and stepped into the sanctum, and the temperature dropped at once. Frost laced the inner edges of the doorframe, glittering faintly in the green-teal light pooling across the chamber. The navigators lay arranged in a circular formation around the central auger, their bodies motionless beneath shrouds of ritual cloth stitched with the icons of their house. Their third eyes were closed, sealed beneath layers of protective but their breathing came in thin, shuddering gasps. A few whispered broken prayers, each syllable trembling as though forced through a throat that resisted speech. The senior navigator, Kedron Vol, knelt beside the auger throne with his face cupped in his palms. His robes hung heavy with frost, and when he raised his head to look at me, his features carried the drained pallor of someone who had glimpsed too far beyond sanity's border. His voice emerged as a thin rasp. "Something is watching us." I stayed silent. Words felt like intruders here. He gestured weakly toward the auger, not the warp storm itself, not the tide's eyes. He swallowed hard, throat convulsing, not eyes in the sense you imagine, not organs, not creatures, awareness, a pressure against the veil, subtle at first, then unmistakable. His hands trembled as he wiped frost from his brow. It noticed us when the Astronomican dimly leaned closer, lowering his voice. I saw corridors in the dark and possible pathways shaped from fractured starlight. Souls drifted along them, not dead, not alive, echoes pulled thin by something that wanted to remember them. He shivered as though reliving the vision. They turned when we crossed their path, not toward terror, toward us. The sanctum lights flickered. A whisper brushed the chamber, not air, not sound, but a suggestion of speech forming at the edges of perception. Several navigators cried out, their hands clenching their shrouds. Kedron recoiled, clutching his head as though unseen claws raked across the deeper layers of his mind. I reached toward him, but he raised a trembling hand. Do not touch me. It lingers. His eyes unfocused, gazing through me as if I were becoming translucent. I felt a soul pass us in the tide, he whispered. Not consumed, not whole. It reached toward our vessel as if begging for a name. His breath shook. It knew yours. Ice rippled down my spine. I felt the temperature in the sanctum drop further, frost creeping across the metal floor toward my boots. Kedron's voice shrank to a broken murmur. When the beacon weakens, the dark grows curious, and curiosity in the warp is never passive. The chamber lights dimmed again, not flickering, but contracting, as though pulled inward by invisible hands. The air thickened until it pressed against my skin. I sensed a presence behind the veil, not looking at Kedron, not at the navigators, but directly at me. The breath on the vox line had found another way inside. The warp had opened its eyes, and it wanted to see what we would do next. The sensation of being watched did not fade when I left the navigator's sanctum. If anything, it followed me more closely, clinging to the back of my mind with the persistence of a half-remembered presence walking one step behind. The corridor outside felt warped by it. The lumen strips stretched their glow too far, as though the light itself were being pulled thin, and each shadow appeared deeper than the metal recesses it should have belonged to. The hum in the walls changed pitch, no longer the steady vibration of stressed machinery, but something more deliberate. The slow exhale of a vast unseen lung pressed just beyond the hull. Crew members avoided my gaze. They didn't need to know what Kedron Vol had said. Something in my posture must have betrayed too much. One rating bowed his head so quickly he struck it against a pipe, scrambling away with frantic apologies before I could even acknowledge him. Another clutched a string of prayer beads until the bones of her knuckles whitened. Their fear was raw, honest, and contagious. Whatever followed me had begun to press on them too. Near the aft plasma decking, alarms rang out, soft at first, then rising into sharp, discordant wails. The floor trembled beneath my boots as I descended toward the lower causeway. The air thickening with the smell of overheated metal. Sparks cascaded from a ruptured conduit, showering a pair of engine seers as they labored to seal the breach. One of them, a young adept whose face had not yet been fully claimed by augmetic grafts, looked up at me with eyes wide and glassy. It tore through the shielding, she whispered, her voice hushed as though terrified of being overheard by something that was not present, not matter, not force, a pressure, as if something pressed its will against the plating until it remembered how to open. Her superior snapped a correction in Binharik, but the tremor in his mechadendrites betrayed his fear. They patched the breach, yet the air still throbbed with that same oppressive pulse. It vibrated through my teeth, through the rails, through the distant thunder of the ship's struggling heart. The vigilant petitioner groaned as though some vast tide surged past her, brushing along the hull like fingers tracing the outline of a trapped soul. A crackle erupted across the intership vox, static first, then a single, ragged breath, the same rhythm as before. I froze, the breath stretched, fracturing into a low moan that resonated through the corridor's metal veins. Several crewmen dropped their tools and clamped their hands over their ears, yet the sound wasn't loud, it was intimate, too close, threading itself directly into the nerves. I stepped toward the nearest vox and let grill as the moan broke apart into distorted syllables. The shape of my name surfaced again, this time clearer, as though it drew closer each time it tasted the air. Behind me, the young Engenzir staggered back. "Why does it know you?" she cried, but her voice was not accusatory. It was pleading, the vox line hissed, and the breath shifted into an unnatural mimicry of laughter, thin, hollow, unfinished. Not joy, not mockery, recognition, a memory trying to rebuild itself from scraps of what it once was. I felt the corridor constrict. The walls flexed subtly as if pulled by gravity that did not belong to real space. For the first time since entering the warp days prior, The boundary between here and there seemed to ripple, not break, just ripple, the faintest thinning of reality. Enough for me to sense the awareness lurking behind the veil as clearly as if it stood inches from my throat. It did not feel like a demon. It did not feel like a soul. It felt like something caught between the two, neither alive nor dead, but unable to forget the act of breathing. My name whispered through the vox again, this time in a tone that imitated desperation, as though it wanted to be known, as though it wanted to be recognized, as though, in some lost fragment of its fading identity, it believed I could help it. A sudden jolt rocked the ship, throwing me against the bulkhead. The Gellerfield sputtered, then surged with a violent shudder that made every lumen in the corridor flare white-hot. A roar like tortured metal bellowed through the decks, followed by a psychic pressure that sent several crew collapsing to their knees. The warp had pressed too close. The boundary had shivered. Something recoiled from the field's resurgence, retreating just far enough to leave the air empty once more. The vox fell silent. Only the ragged breathing of the living remained. Somewhere deep inside the ship, the machine spirits screamed their warnings in binary as the Gellerfield struggled to reinforce itself, but I barely heard them. I leaned against the wall, heart pounding, my skin cold, despite the heat radiating from the plasma conduits. It had looked at me again, and this time, it had tried to speak. The warp had opened its eyes, and now it had begun to reach. Sleep on a warp-tossed vessel is never gentle, but after the thing in the vox spoke my name, sleep became an act of faith. Every time I closed my eyes, I half expected to open them, not in my bunk, but somewhere else, some corridor of broken light like the ones Kedron Vol had described, where thoughts drifted like debris and nothing remembered where it had come from. The vigilant petitioner creaked and shuddered around me, a constant reminder that the only thing separating us from that fate was a faltering Gellerfield, and whatever scraps of will the ship's machine spirits had left. The klaxon tore me from a shallow, restless huff. It was not the shrill scream of battle stations or hull breach, but a low, pulsing tone that vibrated through bone and blood. Emergency warp event. I was already on my feet before the lights shifted from fatigued ochre to an anemic, flickering crimson. The air in the bunkhold felt thin, as if half the oxygen had been quietly drained while we slept. Several ratings staggered upright in their hammocks, clutching at the chains as the deck pitched beneath them. The corridor outside rolled like the inside of a throat. The metal seemed to flex in slow, nauseating pulses, and the lumen strips warped subtly, their straight lines bowing inward as though pressed by invisible fingers. I pushed my way through the flood of crew heading toward their assigned stations, the heat of their fear like a physical thing. Someone muttered a litany under their breath, words tripping over each other as if they could outrun what was coming simply by speaking faster. When I reached the Geller core axis, the air had taken on a coppery temps, thick and metallic, as if I were breathing in the ship's blood. Tech priests clustered along the gantries, chanting Binhoric litanies in a desperate rhythm that barely concealed their panic. Sparks flared from the primary generator coils, showering the deck with brief constellations of light that vanished before they touched metal. Swallowed by the oppressive pressure gnawing at the edges of reality, Magos Adept Lathriel stood at the core interface. Mechadendrites splayed like the roots of an iron tree plugging into failing systems. His vox grill crackled with distorted cant as he wrestled data streams into coherence. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge I had not heard before, not emotion. Exactly, but the closest thing his rebuilt throat could manage. Primary Geller harmonics compromised, intrusion pressure rising. The field is being studied. The word hung between us like a drop of cold oil. What does that mean? I asked, though a part of me already knew. One of his mechadendrites twitched, sparking against the console. Standard demonic assault patterns involve force breaches, violent penetrations of the boundary. This is not that. The field is being pushed, prodded, observed. The intrusion varies its pressure in response to our countermeasures. His lenses whirred, focusing and refocusing. There is an intent to understand. A tremor rolled through the deck, sharper this time, jagged like shattered glass underfoot. Somewhere deep in the ship, a bulkhead screamed as stress reached its limit, the sound traveling up through the girders in a long, mournful howl. The tech priests redoubled their chants, their voices merging into a metallic drone as the Geller core flickered, its protective energy washing over the hull in uneven waves. Then, for a moment, just a moment, the field stuttered. It did not fail entirely. It slipped, like a hand losing its grip on a wet rail. Reality thinned. I felt it first as a pressure behind my eyes, pushing outward as though something inside my skull wanted to leave. The air grew thick, syrupy, each breath dragging through my lungs with unnatural resistance. Sound warped, the drone of the chant stretching and distorting into slow, elongated notes that seemed to bend around my ears. The lights elongated into blurred streaks, the angles of the machinery softening, edges smearing as if the world itself were being smeared. Across glass dot then the whispers came. They did not arrive from any one direction. They seeped in from everywhere at once, through the hull, through the floor, through the empty spaces between heartbeats. They spoke in layered voices that were almost words, almost thoughts, as though language were being remembered by something that had never needed it before. My vision blurred. Shapes moved at the edges of sight, silhouettes that did not belong to the living crew. Figures walked along the gantries without disturbing the metal. Their outlines flickered, transparent one moment and nearly solid the next. A man in a tattered void suit staggered past me, his face a pale, waterlogged mask, eyes dark hollows leaking faint green-teal light. His chest rose and fell in shallow motions, though no air entered his lungs. His lips moved around a word he could not quite form. The edges of his body frayed like smoke, torn by unseen currents. He brushed my shoulder and left no physical weight, only a sensation of hollow cold that burrowed down to the marrow. I knew without being told that there was no such man aboard the vigilant petitioner. More followed, a woman in a torn Astra Militarum greatcoat, regimental markings half obscured by frost, ash dusting her hair like the remnants of burned prayers, a child in a civilian pressure coil clutching a cracked toy Aquila that flickered in and out of existence with every step. Their movements were slow, looping, as though they were trapped in the last seconds before some final catastrophe, walking the same motions over and over. They did not see us, but something behind them did. Every time one of those drifting figures passed, the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest until my ribs ached. The whispers sharpened. Thoughts not my own brushed the edges of my mind, fragments of fear, regret, desperate pleading. None of them belonged to the living. They felt like fingerprints left in still cooling wax. The field surged again, snapping back into full strength with a thunderclap of psychic pressure. The figures shattered like reflections on disturbed water, smearing into streaks of light before vanishing. The whispers cut off mid. The air thinned, rushing back into my lungs with such force that I doubled over, gasping for a heartbeat. I could still feel them, not as visions, not as ghosts, but as impressions, pressing against the boundary, unwilling to fade. The brief slip of the Gellerfield had done more than expose us to the warp. It had exposed the warp to a sand. Something within it had taken the opportunity to show us its collection. The shape of a soul in transit was not a neat, luminous thread, guided gently toward some promised destination. It was a smear, a loop, a repetition of the last moments before everything broke. And if those impressions were all that remained, then whatever was out there was very good at keeping them. Even after the Gellerfield stabilized, the air retained a faint aftertaste of cold, the kind that settles deeper than skin, as though something had passed through us and left a residue behind. The tech priests hurried to reassert rites of containment, their binheric chants rising in frantic metallic trills, but their movements lacked conviction. Every one of them had seen the same impossible silhouettes pacing the gantries, reliving the last seconds of lives that never belonged to our ship. No amount of ritual could scrub away the memory of their hollow eyes, nor the knowledge that they had touched us without ever truly being present. Magos adept Lathriel withdrew his mechadendrites from the Geller console, each limb retracting with a metallic shudder that betrayed strain. He turned toward me with a slowness that suggested calculation rather than exhaustion. The field integrity restored itself too quickly, he said. Too easy. Something relinquished pressure as soon as it expressed its intent. Intent. I repeated, though the word chilled me even before I said it. His lenses refocused, the faint hiss of pneumatics underscoring each adjustment. Those impressions, those fragments of forms were not attempts at intrusion. They were demonstrations, data, samples. His voice dropped into a register that carried the barest tremor of unease beneath its mechanized calm. It wished us to observe. Before I could respond, a klaxon blared again, short, clipped, almost hesitant, as though the ship itself feared attracting attention. The Vox line crackled to life overhead, but no human voice followed the static. Instead, a thin, wavering hum threaded through the speakers, a sound I recognized at once. It was the same hum that had preceded the breathing on the earlier transmission. This time, it coiled through the corridors with greater confidence, weaving between the bulkheads like a thread unspooling. The lights dimmed, but not from a power fluctuation. They dimmed as though something were leaning over them. I stepped into the main causeway, the deck trembling beneath me in short, irregular pulses. Crew members emerged from adjoining corridors, their eyes wide, their mouths tight with dread. A young raiding clutched at my sleeve, her voice little more than a breath. Is it happening again? Are they coming back? Before I could answer, the hum shifted. It deepened, taking on a texture like the rattle of air moving through a ruined throat. The crew around me tensed, several instinctively drawing away from the speaker grills as though the sound were a touch. The hum pulsed once, twice, then unraveled into a familiar cadence. Breath. Slow at first, then faster, as though the thing behind the veil were practicing the rhythm of life. My name followed, clearer than before, shaped with startling accuracy, as though the more it spoke, the more it remembered the voice it once had. The corridor froze. I felt the eyes of every crew member turn toward me, not with accusation, but with the frail hope that I held some explanation, something that would make the impossible feel survivable. But I had no answers, only the growing certainty that whatever had reached for us was slowly shaping itself into something that could reach further. Another pulse rippled through the deck, followed by the metallic groan of bulkheads bowing under pressure that did not exist in real space. Then the air thickened, not with heat, not with cold, with presence, a weight like a thought staring too closely. Shapes flickered at the edges of my vision again, not full forms this time, but smears of motion, phantom outlines dragging themselves along the edges of reality as though caught between frames. One drifted near the far end of the corridor, a silhouette of a man whose joints bent at incorrect angles, like his body had been reassembled from a memory someone didn't fully understand. Another lingered near the ceiling, suspended as though floating in water, her hair drifting upward in currents we could not see. They were watching, not reenacting, not looping. Watching. The breath on the vox shifted, sharpening with excitement, as though the presence recognized that its fragments had found us. A thin, broken laugh hissed through the speakers, an imitation of human sound wearing the shape of amusement, but not the meaning. Something learning, something trying. A sudden surge of light erupted from the gala conduits, the field roaring back with a fury that made the metal vibrate violently. The silhouettes spasmed, stretching like reflections in shattered glass, before collapsing in on themselves and vanishing into streaks of teal and soot-black shadow. The pressure lifted, the air thinned, the light steadied. The vox cut to silence. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Lathrie's distorted voice echoed down the corridor, intrusion patterns expanding. It is adapting, observing, learning shapes, learning us. I turned toward him, but the words that formed in my throat refused to leave, because I had felt it tooth a shift in its attempts. The way it shaped my name with increasing clarity, the way its phantom impressions had begun to linger a heartbeat longer each time. The veil thinned. This thing in the warp was not a demon, nor a soul, nor an echo left behind by the dying. It was something caught between all three, something curious, something lonely, something hungry. And the shape it wanted to take was becoming clearer. Rumors spread through a void ship the way cold spreads through bunk quietly, inevitably, with no respect for rank or reason. By the time the vigilant petitioner clawed its way back to the dimmest trace of the Astronomican's distant glow, the crew whispered of things they dared not name in the open. They spoke in murmurs, exchanged during shift changes, or mumbled into the stale air of their bunks, their eyes shifting as though the shadows themselves strained to listen. Some claimed the warp had singled the ship out. Others insisted that the thing calling my name had followed us from some graveyard of forgotten vessels. But beneath every fear, spoken or unspoken, lay a deeper terror rooted in imperial myth, that souls lost in transit did not simply vanish, they wandered. I heard variations of the tale from every corner of the ship. A graying plasma engineer with grease worked deep into the lines of his face, swore that a drifting soul sometimes found guidance in the Emperor's light, pulled like iron filings toward the beacon on Terra, even if the flesh it had belonged to had long since decayed. A junior astropath, still trembling from the psychic lash of our earlier encounter, claimed the opposite. She whispered that the Emperor's radiance only illuminated the path for the living, not the lost, and that any soul severed from its mortal shell was left to grope blindly through a realm that had no mercy and no memory of what it once was. But the oldest stories came from the navigator's Kedron. Vol summoned me to the sanctum again, though this time he did not kneel beside the org. He sat slumped against a wall, his breath thin and irregular, as though each inhalation cost more than he could afford. The frost had melted from his robes, but a faint sheen of sweat clung to his skin despite the cold. When he raised his head, I saw the exhaustion pulling his features taut, yet his third eye, sealed for safety beneath layers of ointment, throbbed faintly beneath its shroud, twitching as though something behind it strained to escape. "There are paths in the warp that mortal minds cannot comprehend," he said softly, corridors shaped not by space or distance, but by sorrow, regret, longing. Some navigators see them in the instant before death, a last glimpse of roads not meant for the living. His voice trembled. Most believe those are visions born from dying minds, but some say those roads exist. His hands tightened around the fabric of his sleeves, knuckles whitening. We call them the Emperor's silent road, not because the Emperor built them, nor because he guides them, but because no soul who walks them ever speaks again. They drift. They follow currents that do not lead toward terror or salvation. They follow the gravity of memory. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a ragged whisper. A soul that dies in transit fractures. The warp tries to swallow it, reshape it, tear it apart. But sometimes pieces endure. Pieces cling to what they loved, feared, or could not release. Those fragments form silhouette echoes, walking without awareness of themselves. His eyes flicked toward the sanctum door as though fearing those very shapes might slip through the cracks again. What you saw, those were not ghosts. They were remnants. I felt the cold deepen in my chest. Remnants of who? Everyone, he whispered. If the Geller field fails, every soul becomes one. For a moment neither of us spoke. The hum of the ship felt distant, muffled, as though a layer of cloth had been draped across the sound. Kedron's breathing grew more uneven, each inhale catching as if pulled back by some unseen hook. There is another rumor, he said, voice so low I could barely hear it. A forbidden one. Some navigators whisper that the Emperor's light does reach the lost, just not in the way we understand. They say his radiance does not guide souls home, but judges them, that he gathers only those fragments that still cling to hope or duty, pulling them toward terror in silent procession. The rest, those broken by fear or consumed by regret, are left to wander until something else claims them. He closed his eyes. But these are only stories, shaped by fear and centuries of whispered tradition. No navigator who sees the silent road returns whole enough to speak truth. I thought of the figure in the torn void suit, the woman in the frost-laced greatcoat, the child with the broken aquila, their movements looping, their forms fraying. Not dead, not alive, lost. Could the thing speaking to me be one of them? I asked. Kedron opened his eyes again, and for the first time since our ordeal began, I saw genuine terror there, an emotion that had nothing to do with demons or warp aberrations, but with uncertainty. If it were a remnant, he whispered, it would not grow clearer. It would fade, but yours listens, learns, adapts. His breath shuddered. It is becoming aware. He gripped my arm suddenly, his fingers icy. Whatever it is not walking the Emperor's road. It is walking toward you. The ship groaned, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the sanctum walls like the cry of something wounded. The lumens dimmed again, only for a heartbeat. But in that heartbeat I felt it. A presence leaning close to the boundary, testing it, remembering the shape of my name. The rumors were only rumors, but some rumors wait for the moment they can become real. The rumors should have remained stories, comfort for the frightened, warnings for the pious, superstitions whispered in the spaces where the Emperor's light fell thin. But as I left the navigator's sanctum, they clung to me like threads of cold drifting smoke, each one tightening around my thoughts. The corridors outside felt narrower than before, the lumen strips casting long, wavering shadows that pulsed in quiet imitation of the warp's rhythm. Even the familiar groan of the ship's spine seemed slower, deeper, as though the vigilant petitioner listened to the same myths I carried and found them plausible. Crew members gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones that broke apart the moment I approached. Some bowed their heads, not out of respect or duty, but out of the fear that speaking too loudly might draw attention from the unseen presence stalking our hull. Others watched me as though the shape of my shadow might reveal something unspoken. They knew the thing in the warp had spoken my name. Fear turned that simple fact into prophecy. Near the central stairwell, a chaplain knelt before a crude makeshift shrine built from scrap metal, broken wax seals, and a scorched aquila plate torn from a damaged bulkhead. His voice was hoarse from hours of prayer, and his hands shook as he traced the sign of the eagle across his chest. When he saw me, he beckoned with a trembling gesture. You feel it too, he rasped, not asking but declaring, the weight pressing against the walls, the hunger. Before I could answer, he leaned closer, breath quick and uneven. There is a heretical theory or condemned that the Emperor does not illuminate the Astronomican alone, that fragments of him, shards of his will, linger across the Imperium, guiding and gathering the lost. Servants call them aspects, scholars call them delusions. But they say these fragments search for souls on the brink, drawn to them like embers to dry tinder. I stiffened. Are you suggesting the Emperor's fragment is calling to me? He shook his head violently. eyes widening with fervent fear. No, that is the mercy of the tale. Whatever knows your name is not him. He exhaled, a bitter, exhausted sound, which means something else has taken interest, something that may have once been human enough to speak, human enough to remember the shape of a name, but no longer belongs to any road the Emperor oversees. He bowed his head again, dismissing me with trembling devotion. I left him to his desperate shrine, feeling the weight of his warning settle into the hollow behind my sternum. Farther down the corridor, the ship wardens whispered another story, one forbidden even to repeat beyond undertones. They spoke of a phenomenon called the unlit procession, a trail of drifting souls said to wander the warp searching for the ships they had died aboard, pulled not by duty or faith, but by unfulfilled memory. According to legend ever confirmed, always denied, the Emperor did not intervene in such wanderings. He could not. Souls fractured by warp transit became half-thoughts, unable to feel his radiance, unable to hear his summons. They followed instead the faintest echo of familiarity, a voice they once knew, a name they once spoke, something they had loved or feared. It was only myth, yet myth had begun to feel indistinguishable from observation. The gantries above shuddered suddenly, a soft metallic vibration that ran through the decking and climbed the walls. Every lumen flickered in sequence, not at random but in a slow ripple that traveled down the length of the corridor as if something moved just behind the lights, tracing its path through the ship like a fingertip sliding along a pulse. I felt the breath before I heard it, a soft exhale brushing the back of my neck, too warm to belong to the ship's ventilation, too close to belong anywhere but directly behind me. My muscles tightened, instinct clawing at my spine, but I forced myself to turn slowly. No one stood there, only the corridor, only the failing lights, only the faint scent of something that did not belong, like dust burned by starlight in a place that had never known stars. The vox grill nearest to me crackled softly, like someone drawing air through their teeth. Then came the sound that had haunted every moment since the first transmission. My name, spoken with precision, spoken with intent, spoken with recognition. But this time it did not sound like an echo struggling to remember language. It sounded like someone standing inches away, whispering through a veil thinner than skin. I stepped back, heart pounding, breath caught tight in my throat. The whisper lingered, dragging itself across the boundary between us. Ca. Edrin Val had warned that the Emperor's silent road belonged only to fragment souls, too broken to notice the living, too far gone to reach for anything but their last memory. What followed me now was not fading, it was sharpening, not a remnant, not a lost echo, something becoming whole through repetition. And the road it walked was not lit by the Emperor, it was lit by me. The moment the whisper faded, the ship seemed to breathe again, but not with relief. The air expanded in a slow, trembling exhale, like lungs recovering from a shock they had endured too long. Every lumen overhead flickered with uneven cadence, the metal beneath my boots vibrating with a restlessness that suggested the vigilant petitioner had realized something terrifying. The presence was no longer testing us. It was approaching. We were far enough from the Astronomican now that its distant glow was little more than a memory. The warp currents around us had slowed, not because the Imperium was calm, but because something within it had settled its attention squarely on our hull. The void outside was no longer a sit, was an eye, dark and depthless, waiting for a response. I pushed myself toward the upper decks, where the ship's observation blister protruded like a cold glass dome into nothingness. The climb was long, through ladders trembling under psychic pressure, past bulkheads etched with fresh stress fractures that had not existed an hour before. The air grew colder with each level, as if rising further from the engine heart diminished the faint heat left in our failing systems. My breath steamed in the dim light. When I reached the blister, I found one figure already inside, the young astropath who had spoken of drifting souls. She stood motionless before the curved glass, her hands clasped at her chest, her milky eyes wide with an awareness deeper than sight. The green-teal glow of warp light shimmered faintly across her skin, pale as parchment left too long in cold. She did not turn when I entered. "It is close," she whispered, "not outside, not inside, between." I stepped beside her, following her gaze or what served as her gaze or with void beyond the blister. No stars visible, no storms, only a blackness so complete it felt almost tactile, like cold velvet pressed against the dome. Then, as my eyes adjusted, the texture shifted, not with motion, but with suggestion, as if the dark were thinking about taking shape. The astropath's fingers twitched. "Do you hear them?" "Hear what?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. "The unclaimed," she murmured, "souls that slip from their bodies before the warp devours them fully. They drift at the threshold, seeking names, seeking memory, seeking any anchor that makes them feel whole again. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to music only she could perceive, the one that calls to you. It is not merely echoing, it is choosing. A chill slid down my spine. Choosing what? She drew a slow, shuddering breath. A shape. The darkness outside pulsed a subtle ripple, as if a long-distant shiver had passed through it. Lines of faint teal light traced themselves through the void. Not glowing, but shimmering like the afterimage of lightning burned into closed eyes. They formed no pattern at first, drifting like smoke in reverse, gathering rather than dispersing. Then the filaments began to converge, weaving themselves into a faint silhouette, thin, tall, vaguely humanoid, but distorted as if sculpted from memory rather than matter. The astropath winced, clutching her temples. It remembers dying, she whispered. It remembers breath. It remembers your name. It tries to rebuild itself from these scraps. I stared, unable to look away as the shape pulled itself closer to coherence. It was as though an artist with trembling hands sketched a figure from fragments of a forgotten portrait, each stroke incomplete yet desperate, a faint outline of a face, the hint of shoulders, the suggestion of ribs like broken branches. Not a ghost, not a demon, not a soul, something in between, shaped by longing. It was a person once, the astropath breathed. Long ago or moments ago, there is no time in the warp. But what remains of them is held together by need, not identity. It is lost. She turned toward me then, her clouded eyes glistening with fear. And to something lost, recognition is salvation. The silhouette trembled violently as though the act of forming itself strained whatever thin cord bound it together. Then it pulsed outward with a sudden lurch, no longer drifting but pulling, like a tide rising against glass. The dome vibrated. A hairline fracture etched across the lower edge with a faint, brittle crack. The astropath gasped and stumbled back. It is trying to cross. My pulse hammered in my ears. Can it? No, she whispered. Not unless the boundary weakens again. Her voice dropped to a near-silent shiver. But it will keep trying. And the warp listens to persistence. Outside, the silhouette pressed closer, its half-formed face contorting as though struggling to understand its own features. A hollow impression of a mouth opened, shaping breath. My name echoed across the blister, not through the vox, not in the air, but inside my mind. Spoken with aching clarity. The astropath staggered against the glass, tears streaking her pale cheeks. It is not calling to you, she whispered. It is calling through you. The fracture widened only by a sliver, but enough. Whatever became of an unclaimed soul, it was not peace. It was not rest. It was this, a desperate, incomplete thing clawing its way toward the only voice it still remembered. And I was the door it had chosen. The crack along the blister's glass glimmered like a wound, thin but alive, pulsing faintly, with the rhythm of something that had never known a heartbeat yet yearned for one. The silhouette outside remained fixed against the void, its form trembling with each attempt to remember itself. The warp around it rippled, stretching outward in pale, shivering waves that bent light without illuminating anything. The ass clutched the railing, her breath coming in quick, shallow pulls. It's not just shaping itself, she whispered. It's shedding pieces. Everything it cannot hold together, it throws away. Every attempt brings it closer to collapse or breakthrough. The words felt like cold settling in my bones. I stepped closer to the fracture, half expecting the Warp Borne silhouette to recoil. Instead, it leaned nearer. Distorted ribs expanded in the rhythm of breathing, though no lungs existed beneath its outline. The half-formed face flickered, fading, in and out of coherence like a memory trapped between forgetting and awakening. A faint exhale washed across the glass. Impossible, yet undeniable. It did not fog the surface. It simply existed, warm, intimate, horrifying. My name is the tether, I murmured. The astropath nodded, knuckles white around the rail. Every lost soul needs something to anchor itself. A word, a feeling, a voice. It does not want to devour you. It wants to become something again. But the warp is a brutal sculptor. It will twist whatever it touches. The moment it pulls through, it won't be what it remembers. It won't be what you expect. It will be the shape the warp allows. The fracture creeped upward another fragile millimeter. So slowly the movement felt imaginary until the glass sighed beneath the pressure. I reached out, stopping myself only when my fingers hovered a breath from the surface. The silhouette froze, its outline sharpened, shoulders squared, the faint ripple of a chin lifted. It mimicked my posture immediately, with eagerness, with fear, or with mere primitive instinct. But the movement was smoother this time, as if it were finally learning how to move like something human. A whisper curled into my mind, smoother than before, threaded with something heartbreakingly close to emotion. Help me, the astropath gasped sharply, Do not answer. It's pleading, I said. It doesn't understand pleading, she countered. It only understands resonance. You speak, it shapes. You pity, it fills that outline. You fear, it becomes a shadow of that fear. The warp around the silhouette brightened. Threads of green-teal light spiraling around it like veins illuminated from beneath thin skin. The figure lifted its head fully now, revealing a semblance of ice-hollow ovals, deep as starless pits, pulsing faintly with the color of thoughts unfinished. They fixed on me with desperate hunger. Not for flesh, not for my life, for my meaning. The dome cracked again. This time, loudly a shrill alarm screamed through the blister. Bulkheads sealed off the observation deck in thick slabs of reinforced metal, but even they trembled as the warp outside pressed closer. The silhouette threw itself against the glass. Not in rage, not in violence, in yearning, in panic. Each impact smeared its form like ink dragged across water, only for the shards to reassemble with frantic urgency. It believes it is dying, the astropath sobbed. It doesn't know it's already dead. A final shudder ran through the vigilant petitioner. The jellyfield surged with renewed strength, a violent pulse that slammed through the ship in a wave of golden static. The dome lit up in a blinding flare, the silhouette convulsed. Its form stretched thin to thin, its limbs unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. Its mouth opened in a soundless cry, a shape of pain that had no concept of language yet echoed in the marrow of my bones. Then it snapped apart, not shattered, not destroyed, released. The pieces of it scattered outward, dissolving into streaks of teal light that vanished into the void like sparks flung from a dying star. The pressure against the glass ceased. The fracture stilled. Silence fell, not the suffocating silence of something lurking, but the hollow, aching quiet left when something stops calling your name. The astropath collapsed to her knees, tears glistening on her parchment-pale cheeks. It was becoming whole through you, she whispered, but the warp never lets anything become whole. I stared at the fading afterimage burned into the surface of the dome. A faint outline lingered there just for a moment like the residual warmth of a hand long lifted from frosted glass. It remembered me, I said softly. She shook her head. No, it remembered needing to be remembered. The gold fade of the gala surge dimmed slowly, returning the blister to its muted gloom. The warp outside no longer pulsed with attention. The void had closed its eye, but I knew, with a certainty that carved itself deep into me, that the silhouette had not been unique, not rare, only the first to reach this close. The fates of unclaimed souls were not myths. They were truth buried, under fear and centuries of denial, fragments wandering the dark, desperate for shape, for memory, for the simple reflection of what they had once been. When the Astronomican dimmed, they drew near. When the Gellerfields faltered, they touched the veil. When a voice answered, they followed. And somewhere in the endless dark beyond the blister, I felt other silhouettes drifting, stirred by the echo of what had just happened, drawn by the faint resonance of a name spoken once too clearly. The warp had no shortage of lost souls, and now some of them knew mine.